Hello, I'm very pleased to participate in the CPHI conference this year. I'm Adrian van Hoven. I'm the Director General of Medicines for Europe. We represent the manufacturers of generic, biosimilar, and value-added medicines. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a changing policy environment for medicines manufacturing and sale in Europe. It's quite important because the European Union is engaged in the process of reforming all of its pharmaceutical legislation. And I'll take you through that today. So the first slide, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about my association, Medicines for Europe. We have about 50 companies representing different types of manufacturing and development. Our industry supplies about 70% of the medicines in Europe on a volume basis. Of course, on a value basis, unfortunately, it's much lower, but we play a big role in the supply of medicines to patients. So one of the first things I wanted to talk about was the pharmaceutical industry in Europe. So it's still very, very relevant to the European economy. And that's one of the reasons why there's a big interest from the European Union to revise its pharmaceutical legislation. So just for our association, Medicines for Europe, we represent companies with about 400 production sites in the European Union. Employing about 200,000 people and major contributors to research and development in the local economies where those companies are based. Our industry also plays a very big role in security of supply. A couple of years ago, I would have never talked about this issue of security of supply, but of course, due to COVID and the huge surge in demand for medicines, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, we played a very important role working with our companies to make sure that we could prevent shortages driven by this huge surge in demand. And notably, our industry played a big role in preventing shortages of emergency medicines for hospitals, but also are playing a supportive role to vaccine developers as part of the production chain of many of the COVID vaccines. Finally, we play a very, very big role in healthcare. So off-patent medicines, if you wish, cover about 80% of the therapeutic needs of patients and really play an important role in enabling competition and savings and reinvestment into healthcare. Now, one of the things the European Union is looking at is to reform its policies to support a competitive industry. I think the main driver for that was really impacted by COVID because security of supply has become a very important topic and manufacturing has become a very important topic in the EU, as I guess is the case in other jurisdictions like the US or in Asia, etc. So one key thing to remember is that the off-patent sector, as I mentioned, it supplies the overwhelming majority of the medicines, but it also plays a super important role in innovation. So for example, it encourages originator industry to move on and to innovate in new drugs because they lose the market, let's say, to generic and biosimilar competition over time. It also enables lower combination treatment costs. So often new originator drugs that are used in competition can only be used with generics or biosimilars because otherwise they would be too expensive. So there are a lot of, let's say, critical roles that our industry plays in terms of innovation. I think what's also coming up now is there's a lot of interest in innovation on the off-patent side, at least in Europe. So certainly repurposing of medicines. This was a big topic during COVID-19, but it continues. And there's a very strong interest in repurposing and reformulations now in European policy. And I think this is something that's going to develop over the next few years. And there are going to be several big projects sponsored by the European Union to encourage this kind of innovation going forward. One thing that's also important to underline is that our industry in Europe has played a key role in bringing competition to complex forms of medicines like biologics. And as everyone knows, biosimilars were invented in Europe, and the framework, Medicines for Europe was very involved in the regulatory framework set up for this. And this has proved very critical, and I think it's key to delivering access to biological medicines in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere going forward. So I think this kind of development is quite important going forward. I think one of the key questions from a policy perspective is whether or not the EU will support the off-patent industry to develop more targeted developments off patents, like small population drugs, which is difficult to do from a business perspective, at least under the current framework. As I mentioned, there's a lot of interest in off-patent innovation going forward. This was partially driven again by COVID with the repurposing of dexamethasone, but I think even outside of that space in oncology and certain rare diseases, also reformulations for anti-infectives are increasingly discussed at the European level and with the countries as to how we can foster that type of innovation because it's something that can be delivered faster but also quite cost effective. And so that's something that is going to be a big point for discussion for the off-patent industry going forward. Just again to highlight, I think off-patent innovation is coming on strongly. So we do have some incentives, for example, for pediatric formulations. This hasn't really succeeded. So you don't have a lot of off-patent, for instance, pediatric formulations in Europe or elsewhere because there aren't really good market incentives for this. This is something under discussion. I think antimicrobial resistance is also driving governments in Europe to say, okay, what can we do to solve this, as there aren't a lot of novel drugs coming to the market. So then they're looking at ways for our industry maybe to fill the gap in this space. And another area where it's quite strong is chronic disease management, which is very difficult, and where governments are looking for our industry to innovate more and bring more digital solutions, for example. Again, the problem we face is really what is the market framework to enable that type of investment, and that's a challenging proposition going forward. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I began with, which is industrial competitiveness, manufacturing, and regulatory issues. This really became a hot topic in Europe because of the COVID crisis. So obviously, when COVID hit Europe at the beginning, our industry was at the forefront of supplying essential medicines to help physicians, help patients, obviously. And there were a lot of challenges, as everybody knows, because the global supply chains were under a lot of stress. There was a lot of closing of borders, not just external borders to the EU, but also borders within the European Union, which is the first time we've experienced that in a very, very long time. And as a result, the European Union is focused a lot on something they call strategic autonomy. So this is about making sure that Europe has the ability to manufacture certain critical medicines going forward. Another key point, there's a big discussion in Europe now about how to make resilient supply chains. So whether the supply chain is global or more regional based in Europe or what have you, there's again a focus on how to make that resilient to reduce the risk of supply disruptions and shortages, of course. And there's a third pillar, which is economic recovery. Obviously, like a lot of other regions, the European Union suffered a lot economically, and so it's launched a kind of recovery plan with a lot of economic support, and in part targeting our industry. So it's very difficult for governments in Europe to understand actually how much so-called autonomy or how much manufacturing we have in Europe of medicines. This is because medicine supply chains, as anyone knows at the CPHI, are quite globalized in the sense that there's a lot of global trade of different components in medicines production going on, and CPHI is one of the pillars to enable that. And so this is a big discussion. So I think one key thing in Europe is we still are a big producer of FDF, of finished dosage form, including of generic finished dosage form. There are a lot of factories there. But of course, what everybody acknowledges is that Asian countries, principally India, and to a certain extent China, are growing much more quickly or in terms of their development here. So there's a growth on the Asian side, a slower growth on the European side. And one of the concerns from politicians here in Europe is that there were some export controls during COVID. Sometimes there have been some policies out of China that have disrupted supply chains. I don't think these were deliberate political maneuvers, but these were problems that occurred. And so the governments are looking at how to kind of sustain this type of production going forward in Europe. I think the main challenge, of course, is that in Europe you have rather extreme generic market models where governments want very, very low prices for generics. And that's obviously not, very compatible with encouraging investments in manufacturing. So I think there is a discussion now about rebalancing generic markets. Another key area is around sterile manufacturing. So this was, of course, critical during COVID, both for emergency medicines, but also for certain aspects of vaccine production. And here in Europe, we still have a lot of production, but of course, this is not a type of production you can easily expand or very, very quickly. You don't have a lot of reserve capacity for a kind of crisis like we had during COVID. So this is something where you have to switch production. So if there's a demand, let's say for certain ICU medicines or for fill and finish for vaccines, you have to shift your production over to those lines and stop producing something else. So this is obviously a challenge for companies to do in a crisis situation. And I think here, this is what the discussions are around. Another aspect of this is, of course, the regulation. Can regulation be adapted to enable, rapid expansion of production? And certainly during COVID, we experienced this where a lot of regulatory flexibility, as it was called, was introduced by the European Medicines Agency to enable this kind of rapid expansion of production to meet the needs. The last area is around more complex type of production, let's say biologics or other complex forms of production. And obviously the EU is a big producer of this type of production. And this has been super important during COVID-19, as obviously the vaccines are a complex form of production, especially the mRNA, it was basically a biologic form. And so here we've had a lot of discussions about, how quickly can this production be expanded? And if you saw with the vaccines, it actually was fairly quick, maybe not as quick as people would have liked, but it was a fairly quick expansion of production. I think one of the challenges in Europe going forward is how can you make this type of complex form, let's say biologic forms of production, expandable or rapidly expandable. And again, here, I think you need to look a lot at the regulation around this to see how possible it is under regulation to enable this. You have to look at also expanding somehow the use of some of these complex products. Many times they're reserved for narrow, smaller populations, often due to financial restrictions. And those could certainly be lifted going forward with greater use of biosimilars and this type of thing. So really here, in my view, it's about how do we transform these more complex forms from narrow, small population productions to larger scale over time. So another thing, as I mentioned, that's being discussed is resilient supply chains in Europe. And there's actually just over the last 6 months, there's been a big something called the structured dialogue, which basically just means a discussion between manufacturers, regulators, distribution chain people, NGOs, and a number of others about how can we make supply chains of medicines resilient so that we reduce the risk of shortages. And there were 4 kind of areas of discussion that will inform future EU policy making here in the future, and they're up on the slide. So one of them is that obviously the EU wants to support more robust supply chains that can mitigate the risk of disruption. And so there was an interesting discussion about what are the tools or the policies that enable and what are the policies that harm that type of robust supply chain. And I think a lot of it, again, is about, do you have sustainable markets? Are you, totally crushing your generic prices to get the absolute lowest price and therefore driving consolidation in the market? But there were other things about, having more predictable ways to predict the demand so that manufacturers can design the supply chains in a more responsive way to that demand. And a lot of interesting discussions about using more digital tools to improve the predictability of such demand. Another area of discussion is around critical medicines. So this was actually more regulatory agency-led discussion, but industry was involved and other NGOs and stakeholders as well. And here, what Europe really wants to do is to try and define more coherently for all European countries, not one by one, some kind of list of critical medicines. And so what has been done so far is a couple of criteria have been established based on the therapeutic need. So, how much time before it will cause harm to the patient if there's a disruption of the supply, and also the availability of alternatives. Are a lot of generic alternatives available? Yes or no? Then if there aren't, then that might be a critical product. So even though these are kind of general criteria, the idea in the next phase is to apply this to list of molecules and eventually come up with a short list of products that are considered critical. And presumably, if those products are considered critical, we'll modify the market and other rules around that to encourage more investment for a sustainable supply of those products. There was also a big discussion about supply chain vulnerabilities, what causes disruptions in the supply chain, kind of external factors that may apply. Again, a lot of this was a discussion about, our generic markets are being driven to too much consolidation. What are kind of external risks that the EU doesn't really control, this kind of thing. And I think here, again, there was a lot of progress and thought put forward on what could be done to stabilize those situations and reduce vulnerabilities, obviously. And finally, there was a discussion about innovation, investing more in innovation. And I think here the key question is the European Union wants pharmaceutical production to become much greener, so much lower environmental footprint, a very noble cause. I think everybody agrees with that. But they also want to have greater security of supply and if you wish, more excess production, buffer production, if you wish, which kind of contradicts the first objective. So some of the things they want to do here is bring more innovation, especially digital innovation, to manufacturing, to regulation, to make this much more efficient than it currently is in the European Union. So a lot of interesting discussions. And while these are just discussions, they will inform future legislative changes in the European Union around these issues. So you can expect a lot around these supply chain issues in the European legislation in the near future. So then finally, the last part, as I mentioned, Europe has been in a kind of very big recession because of the COVID crisis. And now the EU is investing 750 billion euros, which is the biggest budget the European Union has ever invested, to try and push the economy up again, to create jobs, to put people back to work, et cetera. And what's interesting about this is normally these kind of funds, they target, infrastructure or energy or something like that. And this time they include medicines production and active pharmaceutical ingredients production as one of the targets. So they want to support investment in the pharmaceutical sector as one of the key objectives of the European recovery. So I think that's good for jobs and for security, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is something that is a good opportunity. The main challenge is that the European Union's rules on competition limit how much funding these companies can actually receive. So I think there has to be a reinterpretation, if you wish, of EU competition law to enable the EU to fund the industry that it's asking to fund. Sounds a little bit crazy, but sometimes that's how European regulations trip up the objectives of the EU itself. Another aspect that's kind of related to this is during COVID-19, obviously, I think like everywhere, Europe's regulatory agencies had to move to virtual, and everything had to become suddenly very digital. And, that was obviously a bit of a challenge. But actually, for industry, it was quite positive. And I think even for regulators, it was positive because moving to these more virtual and digital approaches and digital tools is actually much more efficient. So there were a few quacks and a few difficulties because the systems weren't, specifically designed for this, but people were kind of forced into it very quickly. But certainly, there was an opportunity to move towards more digital, and that was taken, and it was proven to be much, much more efficient. So I think everybody's really aligned with this now. So in terms of the future changes to EU regulation around pharmaceuticals, I think, there's a greater recognition of the importance of off patents because of how big they are in terms of volumes. There's a key point about, how does regulation encourage competition or discourage competition, or encourage innovation or discourage innovation? And I think there are some problems there in the EU pharmaceutical regulation that could be adjusted. Another one is, does the regulation support supply and availability, or does it undermine it? And of course, most people would say, well, of course it must support supply and availability. But actually, because in Europe we have one single market, so one European market, but we have different rules and regulations or interpretations in the different countries of the European Union, sometimes we have a lot of barriers within the European Union itself. And this could be, for example, different packaging and leaflet requirements or languages. And when you have a shortage situation, you want to move excess stock from country A to country B in Europe. It's actually very difficult to do. And we learned during COVID that you need to have much more flexible, much more efficient rules to be able to do that, because you need to move the medicines very, very quickly across European internal borders. And I think that's something that is well understood now, and that will advance, and that will move towards a more efficient form of packaging and leaflets and things like this, maybe digital forms, to enable this more flexible movement. Because it's interesting to note that outside of the COVID period, most shortages in Europe are not EU-wide shortages. They're localized in an individual EU member state, which means it's probably kind of market-driven. But it also means you can easily solve it by shifting stock from another European country to that country. It's very difficult to do, but it could be made easier through the regulation. And so I think there would be ways to make this much more flexible. And again, on digital, I think really the European regulatory system for pharmaceuticals is overwhelmed by too much paper, even if it's in a digital form. And we could make the system much more efficient for regulators and for industry by having digital tools. And now I suspect there'll be a big investment in the digitalization of the regulatory network in the European Union to enable this to go forward. So just a couple of things about regulation. So, the majority of regulation in Europe actually applies to off-patent drugs. 60% of centrally approved or EMA approved drugs are generic or hybrid off-patent drugs. Around 90% of what are called decentralized procedures. So this is where you get an approval through a national agency instead of through the European Medicines Agency. These are generics and hybrids as well. And so you see the kind of sector, let's say the regulation is kind of dominated by the number of generic applications, if you wish, there. So really, this is central to making it more efficient because there are so many products. In terms of competition, I think some of the things that we're looking at here is, how do you tailor, especially drug approvals for off patents, to make it more efficient and more cost effective. Currently, there's a lot of strong demands, especially for complex products like biosimilars or hybrid products, sometimes not always clear guidance. And this adds to the development costs of these products. It makes it harder to bring them to market. And this makes it harder then to stimulate competition when patents expire, of course. In terms of resilient supply, as I mentioned, there could be a better form of shortage reporting to national agencies, more harmonized data, because currently the way companies report shortages, for example, in each country in Europe is different. So that means you report a shortage in France different than you report a shortage in Germany. So that means if Germany and France want to talk about helping each other in a shortage situation, well, it's very difficult to do, because they don't have the same basis for making the calculation, the data, and all this kind of stuff. So it's impossible to understand anything across borders. And obviously, this kind of thing, could evolve quite quickly. The other thing, of course, we have in Europe is there's a challenge with inspectorates. There needs to be investment in enough inspectorate resources. Right now, most inspections are virtual, but if you have a new product, for example, and some of the production is outside of Europe, but you can't get an inspection. So there are a lot of issues there around inspections that need to be looked at. So not that we need to maintain the same high standards, but we need to find ways to make this happen a bit more efficiently and have good resources for the inspectorates to make that happen. A lot of other interesting developments going on the regulatory side as well. As I mentioned, I think digital is really, really important. We have some companies in Europe that do 60,000 variations per year. So this is a massive amount of regulatory detail. And a lot of these variations are for rather more modest changes, to the product, not major manufacturing changes or something like that. And so this is just consuming too much resource of the manufacturers and too much resource of regulators. And it also can be a major factor in unavailability, because if you get delayed in your program of variations when you're doing 60,000 a year, you might have to delay the launch of some products, or delay the placing on the market of certain products, and cause almost causing shortages in some cases. So this is really a big problem. But I think we can move forward here with the digitalization of the regulatory system. It's something that needs to be done. We recommend at Medicines for Europe that the European Commission really funds all countries in Europe to do this at the same time, so that all agencies move forward on the same basis, with the same digital tools, with the same standards. So this can be interoperable, because obviously that would make a lot of sense. And if the European Commission doesn't steer this, if countries do it one by one, you're going to end up with a mishmash of different systems that won't be able to talk to each other. And that would be very, very unfortunate, and a loss of resources for everybody. So I think an important thing for Europe going forward is driving economic growth after the pandemic, putting people back to work, after people have been laid off or whatever due to the pandemic. And here, I think what's going to be very, very difficult for Europe is that obviously, countries really suffered a lot because of the lockdowns, because people weren't able to run the tourism industry or other industries, heavily affected by COVID. And you can see here on this graph, how bad it is. So some countries will recover fairly quickly in a year or two, but other countries are going to take almost 3-4 years to recover from COVID economically. So countries in Europe are going to be suffering economically for the next couple of years. So typically what happens, of course, when a country is suffering economically, they have less revenues, so they have to cut costs, right? They have to cut. And this could be a challenge going forward for a lot of countries, because there's a lot of debt. So here you can see all the countries in Europe with the high debt, let's say above 100% of their GDP, and it's quite a few countries now heavily affected by this. And so this is something where there's going to be, again, pressure to cut costs. And here you have countries that have recently come under a special procedure called the excessive deficit procedure. So this is where the European Union actually monitors these countries and kind of pushes them to reduce their deficit over time in a kind of progressive way. But usually countries don't like to be under this, because they have the Commission scrutinizing their accounts and their spending and things like this. So it's politically not very, very appealing. But here's one of the challenges. Obviously, healthcare is one of the big areas of public spending in Europe, because almost every country in Europe has a form of subsidized healthcare. And one of the problems during COVID-19 was that countries shut down elective surgeries, they shut down diagnosis, they shut down a number of things. And so for a huge number of non-communicable diseases like diabetes, cancer, cardiac treatment, respiratory, a lot of patients did not get diagnosis. And therefore they had these diseases and they have developed and worsened, but they didn't get diagnosed, and so they obviously did not get treated. So one of the problems we're going to face in Europe, just as governments are facing excessive debt and deficit and have to cut costs, is there's going to be an increase in healthcare costs, because all these patients who didn't get diagnosed during COVID times are going to have to be diagnosed and treated. And if unfortunately their disease got worse, it's going to be more expensive to treat them, because you're going to have to escalate the treatment more quickly. So this is a really, really big challenge for a lot of countries, because they're looking to make savings on their budgets. At the same time, they've got to spend more money on healthcare. So I think, our recommendation, at least in Medicines for Europe, is that countries need to think a little bit medium term, at least, and to say, okay, we're going to have to invest a little bit up front to treat all these untreated patients. because otherwise we're going to have costs down the road, and so we'll get nowhere with our deficits and our debt control and all that kind of stuff. So I think this is going to be one of the key challenges going forward. And I think you can see here, EPF, this is an association of patients in Europe. It's a very, very big group representing all kinds of therapy areas and country patient groups, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see here with this data, that patients really faced a lot of delays of their treatment or diagnosis. And this is going to require governments or healthcare systems to take these patients in, I guess now, and treat them very, very quickly. And that's going to be really problematic. It's going to require an investment. It's going to require big investment into healthcare. And I think that's going to be challenging. Just looking at where our industry might be able to help governments, I think one of the key things going forward is that generics are still super important to drive sustainability and savings into the system and price competition and all that kind of stuff. Sorry, that's my son peering into this. But also, biosimilars are increasingly important to savings and all this kind of stuff going forward. So one of the key things is that to deliver more sustainability and competition in markets, governments have to have more sophisticated policies, because bringing competition in biosimilar markets, bringing competition in complex markets like to respiratory or something like that, requires different policies and more engagement of governments. So that's something that's going to be also an interesting challenge. I think one key point as well is that on generic markets, kind of what people sometimes call commodity generic markets in Europe, I think we've reached the limit of where we can go. A lot of governments have applied cost containment measures after the last recession, which was in 2009. And this drove a lot of manufacturing consolidation, whether of finished dosage form production or API production or what have you. And this is causing a lot of stress in terms of the supply and availability, even of older generic medicines that are quite inexpensive, if you wish. And so this is now a problem. And I think everybody in the European Union, whether it's the industry, whether it's the distribution chain, whether it's governments, they recognize that pushing prices too low or having extreme cost containment measures eventually just creates unavailability and shortages and disruptions in supply. So I think here also there's going to be a reflection about how to attenuate some of these extreme policies, have more supportive policies to encourage more generic manufacturers to enter markets, is another key point for discussion. I think that's going to happen because governments are obviously wanting to avoid shortages of medicines. This is just to confirm this point. So I think one of the challenges in Europe is that the reimbursement or the payment for medicines is done by individual countries in Europe, but the regulation of medicines is done by the European Union. And European regulation, while it has very good effects for safety, for quality, and all that kind of stuff, and of course we support it, it also has a cost. It doesn't come for free. And I think one of the challenges we have is that cutting the prices at national level while increasing the cost and complexity of regulation at the European level, it obviously doesn't work. And this leads to a squeeze and to unavailability or supply disruption issues across Europe. And I think this is also increasingly understood, including by governments. So I think there's going to be a strong focus in Europe on how to reduce the risk of supply disruptions or shortages. And I think there's a lot of strong interest from countries and from the European Commission to do this. So there is already discussions between the countries and the European Commission on how to coordinate policies to harmonize things in a better way to reduce disruptions in certain countries. There's a discussion about limiting cost containment on medicines, for example, reforming procurement to introduce security of supply criteria into there. They want to stimulate, even with EU funds, investment in more manufacturing capacity in Europe. And they want to make the regulation more digital, less complex in order to support sustainability and supply. So I think a lot of these factors are coming together now, and there's a real recognition that our industry and governments need to work together to mitigate these type of risks going forward. Obviously, as I said, COVID-19 has a little bit delayed some of this, but I think it's coming back on stream now. So now I want to talk a little bit about the EU pharmaceutical strategy. So I think almost all of the pharmaceutical regulation or law, it comes from EU law. So even whatever governments do nationally, it comes from a framework of European law. And this is due to the fact that pharmaceuticals are products, and products are regulated by what is called internal market law in the European Union. So even reimbursement, even procurement is actually framed within European law. So there's a lot of freedom for countries to do what they want in that respect. But still, underlying that is actually a European legislation. And certainly for anything to do with the scientific regulation of medicines, it's almost coming directly from European law. So some of the things that the EU wants to change or modify in the pharmaceutical legislation are listed here. And I'll go through them one by one. So one of them is definitely the lessons learned from COVID-19. So I think a lot of this is about security of supply, having a capacity to react very quickly in the event of a crisis situation. Similar to that, the next one is to improve access, so to make sure that poor East European countries have similar access to medicines as the richer Western European countries, but also to reduce the risk of supply disruptions and shortages, of course. Affordability is a big issue. That's not so much a problem for generic products, of course, but more for the innovative side of the industry, a big discussion there. But I think the sustainability point is for the generic side. I think cost containment applied to generics, is a driver of supply disruptions, of withdrawals. It's increasingly clear. Governments acknowledge it. So I think there's an issue. There's this whole digital piece. I was talking about it for regulation. I think also for products, bringing digital devices together with products is an important topic. And then manufacturing, supporting manufacturing, of course, is high on the agenda. So the EU is actually going to change its legislation. So this will mean there'll be a proposal for an amendment to the legislation. Then the parliament will review it, then the countries will review it. You'll have a lot of lobbying and back and forth around it, and then you'll have a new law. And of course, everybody will need to comply with the new law. What's difficult about this is it's not one law. There are multiple legislations and policies that feed into what's called the pharmaceutical strategy. So there's the pharmaceutical legislation itself, which defines the regulations for the approval, the maintenance, the supply of medicines. There's a plan to invest more in cancer to reduce deaths from cancer, obviously. There's investments in digitalization of healthcare, including of the regulation of pharmaceuticals. There's trade law and competition law and how it applies to pharmaceuticals, so how to instill competition and free trade and all that kind of stuff. There's crisis management, so the EU is trying to take a bigger role in crisis management, kind of reflecting what it did de facto during COVID-19, but transforming that into law. There's IP, intellectual property, and so there is actually a plan to modify intellectual property, also specific to pharmaceuticals. So if there's a European patent court established, there's still a discussion whether that will go through or not, but if it happens, likely there will also be Europeanized SPCs, so extension of the rights of the patents for certain products, this kind of thing, discussion going on. And finally, there's the European Green Deal. As I mentioned, there's a big focus of the EU on how to make pharmaceutical production more green, so to limit its environmental impact. It's not new to any industry. Every industry in Europe is encouraged to go down this route, and it's the same for pharmaceuticals. Also, to a lesser extent, the consumption of pharmaceuticals, because obviously some consumption can have an environmental impact as well. So that's the end of my presentation. I've done a tour de table of, I think, a huge number of issues that are up for reform in the European Union. I realize that it's many, many different topics, many different issues, but this is a kind of reform time, a reform procedure that happens only once every 20 years in the European Union. So you can expect it to be a big change. It's going to be very complicated, very long. It will take at least 2 or 3 years for the European Union to make all of these amendments and these changes, but I can guarantee that it will have a very big impact on all of your companies, as you will need to comply and adjust to the new regulatory and market frameworks that will be established for the old continent. If you want any more information, you can look on the Medicines for Europe website, medicinesforeurope.com. We have plenty of information and documentation available there for continued reading. And so I'll thank you, and thank you for attending my seminar.